Welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I started an eco conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, Oxford Clay, I don't just make pottery, I also make books and courses for other potters who want to be more environmentally friendly in their pottery making. And that's what this podcast is all about. And I can't wait to get started. Let's go. Hello, welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. It's lovely to be back here with you. In today's episode, I've sort of been thinking a bit about what episodes to do, and what would be like interesting to talk about, but also like the kind of pottery that you might be making, in the kind of places you might be making it. And I thought, pottery classes, let's do an episode on three simple ways to experiment in a pottery class because I talk a lot about like make your own ash glaze or like make your own pottery glaze, but like realistically when I was going to pottery classes that is not something that I did at all, because there's glazes there and like the teacher might be like, I don't really want you making a glaze. This is kind of like about just hand building pottery or something, not like glaze making and pottery. So I thought, let's do an episode on some really cool things that you can, because you can still experiment in a pottery class. If you wanted to like really use your creativity and be like, say like the teacher's like, you've got a defined project that you're making, you can still experiment in like these three ways that I'm about to tell you about, in a class, even if you've got a very defined project that you're doing. So for yeah, let's do an episode on it, and yeah, it'd be really good. Yeah, because like experimenting is really fun, and it's like following your curiosity. That's kind of what it's all about, really. In terms of like just having a joyful expression of your creativity. And although pottery can seem like it's kind of the like not conducive to that because it's like you need to do things this way, or this is how you make something, or this is how you join clay together, or this is how you make a pot on the wheel, or this is how you hand build this particular thing, or glaze it or something. Obviously there is so much scope to use your creativity and experiment in your pottery, whatever stage of pottery you're at. So that's what I thought. Let's do an episode on if you're in a class, you can still, these are really simple ways that you can experiment in your pottery. Okay, so firstly to say, this episode was actually inspired by a workshop that I went to recently, and it was actually run by Ruth Harris from Catkin Tree Studio, who is on episode 35 of the podcast, and the episode's titled "Cultivating Abundant Creativity with Ruth Harris." So if you want to listen to that, and Ruth has this like special skill of basically seeing things in a really creative way. And this workshop was like no exception. It was basically so the idea of the workshop was that we had to use items that we wouldn't normally kind of use for printing, use them, make some kind of printing implement, and or use whatever we wanted to for printing, and then experiment. We had a sort of experimental phase of the workshop, and then the end of the workshop was like, okay, now create like a final piece, and you could pick like a bag, or I picked like a little zippy bag to print on. And this was really inspiring. I found this workshop really, really inspiring because it reminded me that you can use so many things to make marks, like a mark making. So, for example, Ruth had just brought like so many different items that you just wouldn't, your brain would be like, oh, that's a piece of rubbish, perhaps, like, say, for example, bubble wrap, or like, a bottle top. And then the idea was that we could kind of like use those things to then, like, in a creative way, to then print. And we printed with like fabric paint, and we also printed with just acrylic paint. So yeah, so I thought this would be such a good thing to do in pottery. Like if you wanted to like experiment with your sort of surface decoration, you could basically use anything you wanted to make a mark on your clay. Yeah, the idea came to me when I was in the workshop. I was like, you could do this with pottery. So yeah, thank you, Ruth, for the inspiration. So good. So here are some of the things just off the top of my head. I thought that you could obviously, like, it's good to have like something that's quite robust in because you're pushing it into clay. So here are just some of the things off the top of my head I thought you could use in like a pottery class to make marks on, a piece of clay. Maybe you're making a slab pot and you decorate that, those slabs before you put it together. Or maybe you've hand built a pot and you just stamp the, whatever you like, whatever you want into, to make marks in the surface. And the really cool thing about this in clay is that it creates a kind of really interesting surface that then if you glaze that pottery, some of the glaze will be like thicker in places than others, and it can kind of create really interesting like decorative effects, depending on the surface that you create with the thing that you're using. So here are some things I thought. Maybe a really smooth pebble. That would be a really interesting surface. Maybe a really non-smooth pebble. That would create a really interesting, like, rough surface. Another thing I thought was you could use natural objects like leaves. You could, if the leaf has very big veins, that's something we used actually in Ruth's workshop. So yeah, just to say, I'll put a link to her workshops below actually, and then you can see them all and stuff. Yeah, so leaves, if it's got like big veins, then that could press into pottery really well. Or a shell. Shells are often like very beautiful on the outside. Of thinking like maybe like a whelk or something, with those all those lines and the twists, something like that. You could use loads of kind of like things that like you wouldn't I don't know, just to create a really interesting surface, maybe like a screw, that you would use normally for wood. You could use that, or you could use the side of it with the twists. You could scrunch up some foil and you could stamp that in clay. So many things. So think of anything, yeah, bottle top, like I said, like anything. um, you could probably push it into clay and get a really, really interesting surface. Okay, so that's the first idea. You could do surface decoration with something that's not, usually used to do surface decorations, like something you found yourself, made yourself, and you can do a repeating pattern, and that would be like really cool and totally unique as well. Um, I'm just interrupting this episode to tell you about a totally free guide I've made just for you on how to make a stoneware pottery glaze. So, if you've never made a glaze before, or if you make loads of glazes and you just want a recipe, this guide is for you. It tells you everything you need to know, and it's available via the link in the show notes. Let's get on with the episode. So the second thing I thought was, and this is kind of a progression from the first thing, is that you could make your own mark making tool. So, this would be little bit more permanent. You weren't just like grabbing something like a pebble and pushing it into your clay. You would be creating a bespoke tool to do a sort of bespoke mark in your pottery. And I actually went to a pottery class once where I was making a fish. I did go through a phase of like always making fish. I really loved making fish. And I was making a fish that I thought would be a really good like salt cellar. It was a salt cellar fish. And the body of the fish, so you keep salt in this salt cellar, and the body of the fish was the kind of container of the salt. And the teacher said to me, "Oh, I've got a really good technique for making scales." So this could, I guess, work if you're doing like dragon scales, or like, fish scales or snake scales, or anything with scales. And they took a wooden peg. So in the UK, we have these like wooden pegs that kind of flat. Um, they're like two parts of them. And then they're basically like a flat piece of wood. So you could probably do the same with like maybe like a lolly stick or something like that. But they just had a peg in the studio and they were like, let me just show you this really good tool that you can make scales with. And then what they did was they separated the peg. And then they had like just one piece of peg. And then they basically drew on the tip, on the flattest kind of thinnest part of the peg, they drew like they sort of drew like the corners off the peg basically. So they basically like drew a kind of circular, yeah, it's important that it's circular because it's going to form like one half of the scale going down to the scale sort of point kind of thing. And they basically, yeah, they drew like the corners off the, just with a biro or something, they drew the corners off the peg, and then they carved it with a knife, like a Stanley knife or something that they had in the class. And then they used this the tool to then push into the clay, to then to make a repeating pattern that when you pushed it and then you pushed it next to it and then you pushed it next to it, it actually made scales, really, really good scales, really good looking scales that you couldn't really make if you tried to carve them yourself. So yeah, so that's my second top tip, is that you can make your own tools. If you wanted to make any kind of repeating pattern that is like totally unique to your pottery, you can make your own stamp and stamp it into your pottery. um, okay, and then the third way, or simple way to experiment in a pottery class, is that. So move on to something totally different now, which is glazing, pottery glazing. And I thought about this, and I thought, like, what is one of the simplest ways to experiment that can be a really interesting kind of aspect to your pottery, is the spaces that are not glazed. So this might sound really strange, but basically it's so normally with pottery glazing, you're in a class and they're like, okay, you can glaze your pot now, and you might be painting on the glaze, or you might be dipping your pot in the glaze. But what can happen if you have like places that are unglazed is that you can get really interesting sort of like colors, I suppose, surfaces and colors where a pot is not glazed. So quite often with a kind of stoneware glaze, you'll get this edge to a pot. So I'm holding up one now to the camera, and it's basically the edge of where the glaze meets the. So if you're listening on the podcast, I'll describe it. It's like where the glaze meets the kind of the clay, the vitrified, like fully vitrified clay, you get this really beautiful line quite often of like orange, and it's kind of almost like where there's like the glaze has gone quite maybe thin on the it's basically the joining line. It's almost like if you imagine like the sea, it's like the beach where the waves are kind of lapping, you get the kind of this beautiful kind of orangey, it's quite often orange, this the color. And you can see, I've actually glazed this pot, not fully. This is just, I've basically poured some glaze over the side of the pot, and parts of the pot are like unglazed, and where they were unglazed, they've gone completely orange. And that's just because there's so much glaze around it that it's kind of gone into that unglazed area. So that's a normal unglazed clay surface, is just kind of white, but where there's glaze next to the clay, it's gone orange. And so you can get some really interesting like colors by not glazing areas, if that makes sense. So, and you can also just get like really interesting, like your pot can look really interesting if you leave some areas like unglazed. So, for example, you could do like stripes or something with glaze and unglaze. And yeah, obviously, like if you're, making a mug or something, it is better to have it glazed. It's easier to wash. It's if you're doing stoneware, it's not so important because the clay's fully vitrified, so it's like the water isn't going to soak through the clay. But if you're doing an earthenware pot, you do probably want to have like the glaze on the bit where the liquid's going to be held. But otherwise, like the world's your oyster in terms of like the not having bits glazed and having bits glazed, and you can get some really, really beautiful kind of different textures, with like leaving some bits shiny and like some bits are kind of matte. Yeah, that's a other idea I had of it, like for in a pottery class that would be super easy to do and create some really, really interesting like surfaces and colors, well, orange, or just really interesting colors where it's like more glazed and less glazed. You would get a variation in that orange, and then the full glaze effect, and then the completely plain clay. So I thought that was like a really, like a cool thing to just say, and really, really, really easy to do in a pottery class. um Yeah. Oh, well, so it's like been lovely talking to you about some really simple things you can do in a pottery class. And yeah, so press some things into pottery, make your own stamp to press into pottery, or sort of experiment with leaving certain areas unglazed in your pottery, and yeah, you can get some really exciting results with those aspects. And yeah, wishing you really really happy potting. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. It's been really lovely to talk to you about those simple ways you could experiment in a pottery class. And until the next episode, wishing you very, very happy potting, and I'll see you then. Goodbye. Thank you so much for joining me on that episode. And if you want to find out more about eco friendly pottery, head over to the Oxford Clay website, which is www.oxfordclay.co.uk. Can't wait to see you there.